Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
Hello, my name is Brandon Dragan. I am the author of the new novel, Mr. Bingley, Just as a Gentleman Ought to Be. This novel is a Pride and Prejudice variation, the work of Jane Austen. I will be reading mainly from chapter 4. It is a truth universally acknowledged that the violence by which a man's heart may be consumed must be in want of catharsis. However little known the feelings or views of such a man, consumed by such darkness, may be on his first encounter with slaughter, the truth is so well fixed in the minds of the public that he is assumed to be a blackguard, a scoundrel, and a degenerate, though his true identity and even his motivation be, as yet, unknown. When the gentlemen arrived at the Bingley residence in London the following afternoon, they were dismayed to discover that their return was to be marred by some shocking news out of the British Morning Post. Bingley had come directly to Meryton from the north, where he had been tending to business affairs. It can be surmised, then, that he was somewhat disenchanted by the sullen greeting from his sisters, whom he had not seen in more than a fortnight. Darcy, on the other hand, had met Bingley in Hertfordshire from London. Hence, the dearth of overwhelming affection in the greeting of Caroline Bingley and Louisa, Mrs. Hurst, did not slight him in the least. In fact, he quite veritably preferred it. "Would you have preferred that I stayed in Derbyshire?" Bingley appealed. "No, of course not, brother," Caroline answered solemnly. "Have you not heard the news?" "Have you not heard that I have leased a country home?" Bingley petitioned. "Yes, and a very fine home we envisage it must be," Louisa answered. "But you see, Charles, we have all been dreadfully affected by such horrid news from Derbyshire." "Derbyshire?" Darcy asked, suddenly drawn into the conversation by the mention of his home county. "What's happened in Derbyshire?" "Sir Andrew Fraser is dead," Caroline stated flatly. "Andrew Fraser?" Darcy repeated. "3 nights past," Louisa said, "in his bed." "How terrible," Bingley remarked. "I had not known he was in ill health." "He most certainly was not," Mr. Hurst suddenly spoke from the sofa. "Fraser was vigorous and in fine health." "Yes, I now remember he was an acquaintance of yours. I'm terribly sorry," said Mr. Darcy. "He was a friend, and a fine one at that," Mr. Hurst slurred, his words dangling somewhere between emotion and inebriation. "Have they published the cause of death?" asked Darcy. "He did not die, Mr. Darcy," Caroline answered. "He was murdered." "Murdered?" Darcy echoed. "Yes, butchered, and in his own bed in the dark of the night." "Why do you say the word butchered?" Bingley asked. "That is what they've called him in the papers, the murderer. Derbyshire's nobleman butcher," replied Louisa. "There's no real flow to it, but still rather grim," remarked Bingley, somewhat under his breath. Have they any idea as to the butcher, the perpetrator?" Bingley inquired abruptly. "Not in the least," said Louisa. "Supposedly a prized horse was stolen, presumably by the murderer, and then returned the next morning." "Shocking," Bingley replied. "And the paper does not mention any knowledge or theories as to who might have committed such a fiendish act?" asked Mr. Darcy. "Only to say that all the members of the household have already been eliminated from suspicion," replied Caroline. "Naturally. That would be the first thought, would it not?" Bingley posited. "Such a heinous act must have been realized by a personal connection, no?" "Simply terrifying," answered Caroline. "To think any passing highwayman with murder on his mind breaking into the bedrooms of noblemen and—" "Calm yourself, Caroline," Bingley broke in. "If it were a highwayman, he would have simply poached the horse. No, there must have been such a more personal reason for such an act. Were you acquainted with him, Charles?" Bingley suddenly looked up as if he'd swallowed a mouse. "With whom? Of course not. Why would you ask?" "You seem to have such a strong inclination towards the slayer's motivation," she answered teasingly. "And if I'm not mistaken, you were present in the county at the time of the act." Bingley laughed suddenly. "I was but 20, I mean, that is to say, I was at least 25 miles from Grantley Manor, if that's what you mean to know." "No doubt the constable might like your expertise on the subject then," she retorted. "I merely asked about the horse," Bingley countered. "It's a question of if it was a robbery and not a personal vendetta, why would the pirate leave the horse? I'm sure it's not anything the constable hasn't already considered." The room fell silent for a moment. You're right, Charles, pronounced Darcy. It doesn't make any sense. None of it makes sense. With that outburst, Mr. Hurst was up off the settee. He snatched a carafe of wine from the table on his way out of the room and proceeded rather unsteadily, mumbling all the way, up the stairs and out of sight. He's been exceedingly upset, said Louisa, after another moment of quiet. I've never seen him take to the drink like this. Bingley raised a single eyebrow in bewilderment before approaching the table to pour a drink of his own. I do think too much grief over someone so barely, if at all, acquainted is a fruitless manner in which to conduct ourselves, Caroline eventually stated. Aye, voiced Louisa, especially at a time when we celebrate our dear brother's establishment of a household. Yes, brother, do tell us about Netherfield Park.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Inside the Minds of Authors. I am so excited you guys are joining us today. We have a dear friend that's back on the show after a few years, so this is going to be so much fun. If you're new to the podcast, go ahead and subscribe. You do not want to miss a single episode. We're here every week with new authors and great books, so we're going to get started. Hello, Mr. Brendan. How are you?
Hello, I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm good. Congratulations on the book. I am cheering for you.
Thank you very much.
This is exciting. You have had a very busy couple years. So the fact that you found time to write, I'm kind of going, where? How did you pull that off?
Yes, I have had a very busy few years. I think the last time we spoke was I was just starting law school. In that time, I published my debut novel, The Wages of Grace, put out another novella and a collection of short stories and essays called The Resurrection of Jesse Barrow, and have this new book that is slated for publication October 8th. It should be available for pre sale already for anybody who wants to jump over to Amazon right now. Feel free.
That's what I'm talking about. So we need to start. Where did this idea come from and why? What made you decide to do Pride and Prejudice?
So it's maybe a little bit of an amusing story. My dear wife, Jamie, has always been a huge fan of Jane Austen and her work. And particularly, she loves the novel. She also has always loved the 1995 BBC miniseries of Pride and Prejudice, starring Colin Firth and Jennifer Ely and Crispin Bonham Carter and some other fantastic actors. And so, years and years ago, when we were dating, she introduced me to it. And, it's a 6 hour miniseries, and I had never seen it before. Probably wouldn't have been my cup of tea for a movie night choice, but we watched it and I really liked it. I enjoyed just how witty it was and how Jane Austen paints such a perfect portraits of the absurdity of characters in our life, people who are over the top. And so I really was drawn to that. And naturally, the story of Elizabeth and Darcy, it's a love story for the ages. But frankly, over the years, I got a little bit tired of just hearing about Mr. Darcy, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Darcy. And so we were actually planning a trip to the UK. And I think we were like packing our bags, and we had the Jane Austen tour of England planned. We were going to go to her museum in Bath, the house where she lived, and all these different things. And I mentioned just as a joke, what nobody really knows is that Mr. Bingley is actually the hero of the story. And I think the first thing that came out of my mouth was something to the effect of he's like a Dexter style serial killer, like an avenging angel type thing. And like we had a good laugh about it. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, this is a character that drops out of the novel for a significant amount of time, and who really knows what he was doing? I started doing a little bit of research. I read the novel again, was kind of reading in terms of what policing was like back then. I mean, if you had a murder, there was no police force. So who would solve the murder and all those kinds of things? And so that led me just deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And the more I read, the more I played with the idea, the more excited I got about it. And actually, the following year, and this was all before I went to law school, I had a back injury and was not working for a period of time. And so, really, the bones of this novel was written during that time when I was quite literally on my back. And all these years later, we've refined it and it's ready to be released to the world.
I'm so excited of the fact that you took somebody else besides Mr. Darcy. Because as a person whose friends are in love with him, and I'm like, really? Really? Okay. I feel the same way with you. I'm like, really? Okay.
Yeah, and one of the things that was really fun about writing this was that as outlandish as the concept kind of sounds at first, this idea of a Mr. Bingley who discovers a cabal of evildoers in the aristocracy and like he's the only person who really has the resources and the wherewithal to take these guys on. I did my best to be faithful to the spirit of Jane Austen's work and even the timeline of the novel and everything. And so one of the things that was really fun writing it was having this understory, this current kind of overlaid over the top of her novel. And so it allowed me the opportunity to play with the motivations of some of the other characters as far as we see them do this in Pride and Prejudice, and we think this is the reason they do this, but maybe it's not. And so with Mr. Darcy in particular, and I hadn't really intended this, but it kind of worked its way in. I think I've actually redeemed his character a little bit in the sense of maybe what we see as some of his selfish vanity is really faithfulness to a friend. So that idea, like I said, I think for people who are Mr. Darcy purists, they'll still enjoy how he comes out in this book.
That is so fun and amazing. And the fact that you took very care of her characters. You're not there to destroy them or vandalize them, but just kind of give them that extra layer that sometimes as readers are very passionate about their people. Like, what are you going to do with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say there are a few characters in the novel that don't turn out looking as good as maybe they did in Pride and Prejudice. But having said that, the spirit of Jane Austen's work, kind of keeping that close at heart was important to me to not make it something, and again, the concept sounds outlandish, but to not make it something where this is a completely unbelievable, this would never have possibly happened, or just changing the heart of what she wrote, changing the basis of that and the messages she was trying to get across. I didn't want to toy with that either. In fact, much of my story revolves around so many of those same, you know, maybe they're outdated now, but like these concepts of honor and of when you see a wrong, you act to redress it. You can't stand by and watch bad people do bad things to innocent people. And so I think that probably would have been a message that resonated with Miss Austen. I would hope so, at least.
I love it. So the question is, how is your wife taking this? Because you're messing with her world. Like, let's be honest about this.
That's a fantastic question. She has been incredibly supportive through this process, and yet at the same time, she's had commentary, and much of it has been very helpful. But she does not like Mr. Darcy being messed with, and so in some of those moments where maybe, and especially towards the beginning, where he maybe appears rather calloused and appears vain and self-interested and a little bit mean, obviously, sometimes I have to remind her, he was that way in Pride and Prejudice at the beginning too. So, but no, she's been incredibly supportive through the whole process and offered just so much fantastic feedback and also just help and knowledge with research into the period and connecting me with other people that she knows who are really interested in Jane Austen's work. It's definitely been a partnership as we've moved towards getting this out to the public.
Ooh, I was very much afraid that you were touching on sacred grounds and
Yeah.
Brandon was going to be missing because of this book. Had to ask.
Yeah, maybe I pressed a nerve or two, but I think it comes out in the end.
I'm glad. There has been some resolution and everybody's still happy. What are you working on now? Because you go from one project to the other and they all just kind of flow within themselves. What is next for you?
So, one other thing that I worked on kind of in conjunction with this novel, and this really came much more recently, was a short story that is Pride and Prejudice related. And it's actually about how a younger Mr. Bingley met a younger Mr. Darcy, because we really don't get much information on how these two became friends. And so I thought it would be kind of fun to write a short story. And so if that's not out on Amazon, it'll be available Kindle Unlimited. If it's not out now, it will be very shortly. Other than that, yes, this was a big departure from my normal kind of historical fiction, literary fiction type, writing that I do. I usually carry 3 to 4 projects with me at any given time, and so yes, right now I've got 4 different novels that I'm just it seems like I'll get on a kick and write on one for about a month, and then I just advance it to a point where I'm like, I think this needs to just sit for a while, and I need to think on it. And then, I'll pick up another one and kind of try to advance that a little bit. There hasn't been one right now that's just leaping off the page that's like, this is the next one, finish this. But I'm always thinking about them. I'm always tinkering and working on them. So, but yeah, nothing close to completion yet on a new project.
You have spoken as a true Cancer because as a plotter, like my heart just fell. I was like, you have four projects going on like at the same time and you're bouncing from one to the other. Oh my God. How do you manage to keep them compartmentalized? Like, how do you know, okay, I'm not crossing from one to the other and then they all stay in their own specific universe? Because that's to me is mind blowing. Like, we need to talk about this.
Well, it helps that they all exist in their own universe. It's not like I'm writing 4 detective stories at once. Like right now, I mean, I've got a kind of a serial killer detective idea that I've been working with. I've got another story that takes place among kind of a remote community in Siberia. I've got another one that does involve an undercover police officer doing drug work. And then, gosh, there's another one too that I've been working on. But it certainly helps that there's not much overlap in terms of plot and character from that standpoint. So that makes it a little bit easier to compartmentalize. And I don't know. I don't necessarily my issue is usually I know how it starts. I get a feel for who my characters are, and I typically know how it ends. It's just a question of like that linking of how we get there. And so when I work on a project, that's always kind of the goal. Like I said, the fact that I do kind of have an idea on beginning and end also helps keep those projects separately because I'm not just trying to figure out what happens in terms of on a completely blank slate.
I like it. Where does your inspiration come from to get all these things going at the same time?
I won't necessarily say my life as I'm living it day to day, although doing criminal defense work, there is certainly a lot of inspiration there. But yeah, it comes from my interests. I mean, my family background is largely Ukrainian and Russian on my mom's side and my dad's side too. And so just having been exposed to that culture as a child and as a teenager, and then doing a lot of historical reading over the course of my adult life. I mean, that's an area that I've really wanted to kind of tinker in and play with. And so, like I mentioned, that idea that I've got that takes place in Siberia, that's kind of where that came from. The undercover story. I have an uncle who is a retired police officer and he did undercover work for years. And so, frankly, a lot of that inspiration came from conversations with him in terms of some of the absolute crazy things that he pulled off while working. And then, yeah, as far as this other one, the serial killer kind of idea, I'm a true crime junkie and I love movies like, and books like Silence of the Lambs and The Shining and all kinds of things like that. And so a lot of it, honestly, is just I want to try my hand at different things. I've wanted to try my hand at something that's more of a fable, wanted to try my hand as something that's really gritty and dark and try to find some redemption and some light at the end of the tunnel in that. I enjoy stories with a twist. And so that's some of the other things is I'm really fascinated by, and it's whether it's in writing or just in conversation with a person, how much what is left unsaid influences people's assumptions. And so I'm really interested in like how long can I pull this ruse off where the audience doesn't really know what's going on and then reveal it in a way that feels honest and not just like an out of the blue, I wrote this so that we could have a plot change and take this in a totally different direction. So a lot of it just comes from reading, from talking with people, from documentaries, movies, all those kinds of things.
You've nailed it. I was very happy. You cover a lot of things. Absolutely. As you're going through your process and adding real life into your books, what advice would you give to an up and coming author who's thinking, I would love to start doing this myself?
So probably the first piece of advice I would say is be really careful because if you put something in a book that happened in real life and the person that it happened with reads your book and it doesn't reflect well on them, you have to consider that relationship, right? Like if you write something about your mother-in-law, and it ends up in a book and she reads it, it may not go over too well. And so for me, there's a lot of kind of shrouding. There's a lot of, if I do have that kind of thing, you want to make it disconnected enough from your own life that you're not actually talking about a real person. You're dealing with a character. The other thing I would say, and this is kind of the flip side of that, is to do it honestly. Like, I don't know where this quote came from, who said it, but like I've heard and I kind of keep it close that like the basically what a writer does is you sit down at the keyboard and bleed. What's in your heart, what's in your mind, what you're dealing with makes it onto the page. And so, and I mean, and I can see that in every one of the works that I've published, as far as there are elements of my life at that time and what I was learning, what I was grappling with that make it onto the page. And so honesty is a big thing for me in terms of I want to be honest with my audience and not expect them to make huge leaps that I wouldn't make myself. The other thing is I just always strive to write something that I would want to sit down and read. I never want to make it too elevated. I never want to dump things down too much. I want to keep it in that final, like, there's interest along with action and advancement, and we're not sitting in one place brooding for too long. And so I do think my stories, and I've been asked this question before, I think my stories are probably equally plot and character driven. I think you've got to have a character that people identify with and a character who learns things and changes as time goes on. But you've also, if you just have that character sitting in a room for 360 pages, I mean, I don't want to read that, and so having the plot to advance along with that character development, I think that's kind of the magic sauce.
I'm very much with you. I want a book that I would like to read. So something has to happen and it can't just be all in your head. Like other
Yeah,
stuff has to happen outside your bubble. So yes. So dear, tell
absolutely.
us, where can our listeners find you where they can learn more about you, your books, and everything you have coming up?
Yes. So I am on Facebook and Instagram at Brandon Dragan Author. You can also go to my website, brandondragan.com, and that's Dragan. And then, yeah, my books are on Amazon. And so this new one will be released on Kindle and paperback coming up here, and hopefully shortly we'll have an announcement about the audiobook too. That may be a little bit down the road, but working with a really fun voice actor that I think will make this project fantastic to listen to. So we're just working through the process on that.
Awesome. Well, dear, it's always a pleasure and so much fun talking to you. But before you leave us, are you ready for the lightning round?
I suppose I am.
You're going to be great. Easy peasy. Let's see. Home cooked meals or restaurants?
Oh, depends on who's cooking. But if it's my mom, probably a home cooked meal. If it's me, definitely a restaurant.
At least you're honest enough. You're like, yeah, I don't know about that. Okay. Gummy bears or Sour Patch?
Sour Patch.
Okay. Pirate or Knight?
Night.
Okay. Desktops or laptops?
Laptops for sure. But I've also got to have a desktop set up with a big monitor and a separate keyboard and all. But I got to take my work on the go.
I like a little bit of both. Here's a little different. If you could be any Disney villain, who would you pick?
Any Disney villain. Oh my gosh. I know I'm supposed to say this quickly. And frankly, the only one that's coming to my mind is Jafar. And so I suppose I would be Jafar.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe I like birds or something.
Believe it or not, that one comes up a lot. People tend to go that way. I'm always impressed. I was like, oh, okay, that works. Dear, it's been a pleasure. Do you have any closing remarks for us?
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure as always. I'm really, really excited about this novel and super grateful to anybody that is willing to give it a shot. It's Mr. Bingley, just as a gentleman ought to be.
I love the title. Absolutely. To our listeners, go ahead and check it out. Check out this novel. Check out the website and all the other books. You are going to love them. Mr. Brandon, a pleasure. Congratulations again. And remember, my listeners, we'll be back next week with another fabulous author. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Bye, everyone.